Let's begin our study of the digestive system. Now, as you know, we've already talked about this, but the digestive system is the entrance to the cardiovascular system for many different types of nutrients. Particularly, we're talking about solid and liquid nutrients. We have already looked at the respiratory system as an entrance for gases. The nutrient materials that we're talking about here are going to be used by the human body both as fuel or for the production of energy, and also many of the nutrients are building blocks for the cellular structures and tissues of your human body. So all of these materials are important. Your body saves many of them, so you can go for days or weeks without these nutrients, but only because you can store a lot of these. Now, when we want to look at the digestive system structurally, the digestive system is primarily a tube. It has a variable width as it passes from one end of the body to the other. It gets wide in some places like the stomach and narrow in others. The tube does have some extra or accessory organs that aid the digestive process. We'll talk about those. And food materials that enter the mouth are propelled through the tube by a muscular action called peristalsis. So we have a tube leading from your mouth to your anus. We have some organs that add fluids and materials to the digestive process, and the food is physically moved by muscular action. We've talked about there being a pattern to all of the systems that act as entrances or exits to the human body. And that's the case here. There's always tube-like structures or passageways that lead materials from outside your body deep inside the body. And there's always large membranes for absorbing the raw materials that need to enter the bloodstream, the cardiovascular system. What is slightly different here is that there are also these accessory organs, whole organs that are outside the tube that are going to aid the digestive process. So, one other principle to remember is that the inner spaces of your body, many of these are technically outside the body, and this digestive tube is that. The inside of the tube is geographically outside your body. Even though your body surrounds it, anything that's in that tube has not entered you until you've absorbed it. If anything is not absorbed through the membranes of that tube, that stuff will exit. And in the case of our digestive system, we call that material feces. So, let's talk for a moment about the process of digestion too. Digestion is there to reduce complex food molecules or nutrient molecules into simple ones. This is not that concept of breaking down food that many people relate. It's really best described as a dissolving process. The process does not destroy nutrient materials, but simplifies them, takes large molecules and makes them small. So, and there are 3 stages to this actual digestive process. The first is what we call mechanical or physical digestion. This is a grinding and a liquefying of the food to get it into a very, very liquid state. Once it's in that state, it can then be chemically digested. There are certain kinds of molecules that can do the dissolving, and they don't mix thoroughly with the food unless the food has been ground up and liquefied. Once the food has gone through this digestive dissolving process, then the food can be absorbed And the third step is the actual absorption of those food molecules, where they enter the human body, they enter the cardiovascular system, which then distributes them to all cells throughout the human body. So, what we're dealing with is a tube, and probably the best way to do this is let's start at one end of the tube and just make our way through, slowly describing the various structures that are here. So, we've studied the passageways in the head when we studied the respiratory system, the nasal passages. We talked a little bit about the mouth. We know that the digestive passageway becomes unique when you get to about the laryngopharynx and the esophagus, the food tube, begins right there. All the other passageways are kind of in common with the respiratory system. The swallowing process, and we even described that in the respiratory system, is to close the breathing tube so that food will be directed into the esophagus. And again, we did describe that. And that does allow the esophagus to catch the food, and then that food is going to be propelled to the stomach. The lump of food created by the mouth that is swallowed is termed a bolus, and it passes down the esophagus, as we will see in just a minute. So let's begin at the mouth. The mouth has some fairly simple features here. The purpose of the mouth is, of course, physical digestion, the grinding of the food so that it can be liquefied. And this is accomplished, of course, by the teeth primarily. You have 32 teeth in your mouth. I'm not going to make a big deal about that now, but obviously these are for grinding our food. Other structures in the mouth include the gingiva, which are the gums, and the fauces, which is the opening at the back of the mouth, and the little hangy down thing. Every good medical student should know that that's called the uvula. And it's a trigger for the swallowing reflex. Anything that touches the very back part of the mouth, and especially that uvula, stimulates that automatic swallowing response. And it is. We don't really think about swallowing. It's the one reflex that you're actually born with. There aren't many things that you need to do when you're an infant, but you do need to be able to automatically swallow. And that does happen there. Just outside the mouth are some accessory organs, though, which are called the salivary glands. And these add fluids to your food. There are three of them. There's the parotid salivary gland, named because it's close to the ear, which is literally what parotid means. It's the largest of the three, and it adds some very, very, very watery secretions to the food, which contains some enzymes for digesting or chemically breaking down food. The second of the two, the second largest, is found under the edge of the jaw. It's called the submandibular salivary gland. And the third one is under the tongue, which is what the term sublingual means. The submandibular gland creates a mixture of both mucus and watery secretions. And the sublingual salivary gland secretes almost completely mucus. And all of these fluids then secrete and enter and mix with the food. And in fact, you can't literally swallow your food without these secretions. So the glands are sort of built like this with little tubes, and the white and blue cells that you see there secrete mucus and enzymes. And the tubes then carry those fluids into the space of the mouth to be added to the food. I always think about the fluid needing to be added to the food when I think about my occupation. When I was in college, in my summers, I worked at summer camps. And one time I worked in a kitchen, and we had a great big student chef as well. He was going to some sort of culinary arts school and was using his summers to cook in a camp like the one I was at. And he had a number of different food games, and one of them was a challenge for us to eat a slice of bread in 1 minute, 60 seconds. And of course, we were college students, so we thought, no sweat, we can eat food. We can get anything down our throat in 60 seconds. Well, it turned out to be a much bigger challenge than we thought. And in fact, none of us regulars could do it. This big chef that we have, he was a big Italian young guy, and he could do it in like 57 seconds. But it's literally and nearly impossible to do that because of the amount of fluid that needs to be added to that bread. Now, of course, I'm not talking about Wonder Bread or one of those breads that is filled with so much air that there's not much substance there. But just a more normal slice of bread. If you try and put it in your mouth all at once, you're dead. There's just no chance. The only chance is to eat small bites and try to get them good and liquefied so that you can actually swallow them. Because of the friction, you just can't get any food that's got too much or too little moisture literally down your throat. So the fluids are very, very important to that process. So the bolus of food is then swallowed, and of course you remember some of these parts: the oropharynx behind the mouth, the laryngopharynx down near the opening to the breathing tubes, epiglottis, which covers the larynx and prevents food from entering there, and then of course the esophagus, which carries the food then down to the stomach. And the esophagus does that through a muscular action. The food is literally propelled through the tube by a motion called peristalsis. It's a muscular action. A bolus of food is literally, the tube is squeezed and the bolus is pushed along. That, of course, wouldn't happen unless that little bolus of food was very wet and the tube didn't have some sort of mucus structure or mucous membrane to it. And let's talk about the tube just for a moment, so we can talk about that muscle that's involved in this. Okay? The structure of the tube is like this, and this is pretty much the structure of the tube all the way through. The tube has these common layers to it, and sometimes they're slightly modified for one place or another, but all of this is generally present. The innermost part is the epithelial, what is called the mucosa. It's a simple columnar epithelium that contains goblet cells, so it does produce mucus. Just beneath that columnar epithelium is what is known as a submucosa, and I think right there in the picture you can see a number of glands, little pouches with tubes that actually produce some digestive fluids. Outside of those two layers are two muscular layers, and if you look closely you can see that one of the layers runs circularly, and so when it squeezes, the tube gets smaller or narrower, and the other layer is more longitudinal. It runs lengthwise, and so when that squeezes, the tube gets literally shorter. And those two processes literally squeeze the food along the tube in that peristaltic action that we were just visualizing a moment ago. I liken that movement of the food very much like trying to get a drawstring through a pair of sweatpants or a hoodie. I don't know if you've ever had a pair of sweatpants and perhaps the drawstring that tightens them around your waist has come out of the tube, or at least come away from the opening, and then it's very hard to find it again or move it through, and of course that's because there's so much friction. The cloth of the drawstring and the cloth of the tube make it very, very difficult. And your mom or somebody that sews has a trick for that. And of course, it's to take a safety pin, a shiny, slippery metal pin, and catch the end of the drawstring with that, and then slide that safety pin through this pocket, and it'll slip through there very, very easily. But the action is to shorten the tube, pinch the safety pin, and then pull it out. And so the processes are very much like shortening, pinching, pinching. And that's, of course, what you see here in the muscular layers that move the food through the tube. The last layer, and this is wherever this tube might be in a place where it would rub against something else, would be an outer membrane that reduces any sort of rubbing friction between this tube and any others. And of course, because you have these muscular layers there, there's movement here, and there may be more movement around it, and so friction can be a real danger. So the esophagus and its peristaltic action, its muscular action, then moves the food through the tube and down to the stomach. There really isn't any digestion that occurs here. This is just something to get food from the mouth to the stomach. And so now let's look at the stomach itself. Okay? Now the stomach specializes, like the mouth, in physical digestion. The mouth, of course, did the grinding, especially of very, very hard materials. That food makes its way down to the stomach, and the stomach then takes that and adds lots of fluid to it as well. You probably remember many of the structures here from our dissection. The greater curvature of the stomach is that outside curve of the stomach. The lesser curvature, those are both labeled here in the diagram. You'll remember perhaps the fundus, the large bag-like end of the stomach, nearest to where the food comes in. The pylorus, or the body is the main part of the stomach, not a big deal. The pylorus is the narrow end nearest to where the food is going to leave, and the whole thing is guarded or closed by what is called the pyloric sphincter muscle. This is a circular muscle that squeezes very much like your anus, I think you're familiar with that, and holds the food into the stomach while the layers of muscle churn it, while more and more fluid is added to it. And there is a tiny little amount of digestion that occurs here, but the main process here is to add fluid to the stomach and to the food, and get the food thoroughly liquefied. The muscular layers here, notice that the stomach has an additional layer here. There are actually 3 layers of muscle in the stomach to add not only the squeezing of the stomach and the longitudinal shortening of the stomach, but a twisting motion to the stomach. You can see that the innermost layer there is what we call oblique. The fibers run on an angle and they twist the stomach, kind of like you would twist a washcloth. And that, of course, thoroughly churns the stomach contents and thoroughly mixes them. Another part of this physical digestion is the addition of acid to the stomach. So the stomach has a very, very strong, in the neighborhood of between 1 and 3 on the pH scale, a very, very acidic hydrochloric acid that's added to the stomach. And that also aids in the breaking down of the food molecules in the stomach. Not so much the food molecules, I should say, but anything that sort of encapsulates the nutrients, like especially in foods from plants that contain a lot of fiber. The cellulose that forms the fiber sometimes encapsulates the nutrition. And this is often too why we cook a lot of our plant materials, to try to make them softer and allow them to release more nutrients. Well, the hydrochloric acid here helps do that. And the hydrochloric acid also destroys bacteria that, of course, are coming in from the food that we eat, just from the atmosphere around us that get caught into the food. So the acids have a number of very important actions here. And they even activate some of the enzymes that are here. There's one particular enzyme here that is activated by the acidity of the stomach. You notice I also put a little note here on the slide about rugae. If you look at the inner lining of the stomach, you can see it's all folded. There are lots of little hills and valleys there, lots of ridges. And that ridge-like pattern there are known as the rugae of the stomach. And it makes that inner lining much larger than the stomach would appear. And so if you do put a lot of food in the stomach, the lining can stretch. It's got extra. It's like putting an extra large t-shirt on somebody that wears a small. Okay? So all of this now creates that churning action. And that churning action then that you see here churns the chyme over and over. The waves of muscular contraction from the proximal end down toward the distal end, from where the food comes in down towards where it would go out, just continually churns the food. Only very, very small bits of food and liquefied bits of food are going to squeeze through that pyloric sphincter valve and into the small intestine. So there's a constant muscular churning action when there's food present in the stomach. The chemicals that we were just talking about come from the lining of the stomach. And here you can see those tubular layers that we talked about are found here in the stomach. You can see an outside layer to protect from friction. You can see the 3 layers of muscle there. You can see some mucosa and the very colorful cells that are found there in the mucosa. So let's look at those. The invaginations, or the little structures here that dive so deep within the mucosa, are called the gastric pits. And in a microscope, they look something like this. You can see they're deep folds of the epithelial membrane down into the submucosa of the layer there. And the epithelial cells that you see here, and they're in different colors, different cells are there for different purposes. Like those surface cells and the ones that go down into the pits are for mucus production. They produce mucus that helps protect the stomach lining from acid and from various enzymes. The little blue cells that you see there in the picture produce the hydrochloric acid that we described a minute ago. And the little red cells that you see down deep in there are the ones that produce some enzymes that help the digestive process. So, all of these cells are producing fluids that leave these little gastric pits, mix in with the food, and help to accomplish the digestion. So, let's finish up by maybe talking about how the mucus does protect the stomach. the acids that are produced by the stomach could digest the stomach itself. When you have an acid that's in the pH range of 1 to 3, this is a very, very strong acid. If you had it on your hand, it would begin to burn the structure of your hand, literally begin to eat away at the cells. It doesn't in the stomach because of the mucus activity. The mucus cells that you saw there in the epithelium produce mucus at a rate that exceeds the acid production. And in fact, if the acid starts eating through the mucus and getting too close to the cells, that acid stimulus causes the cells to produce more and more and more acid. Almost like if a person is out in the sun too much, the radiation there will stimulate your cells to produce a coloring that blocks some of those sun rays and protects your skin from the damaging effects of the sun. Same thing here. The damage of the acids, or the threatened damage of the acid, will cause cells to produce excess mucus, and that mucus then is the barrier that won't allow the acid to get to it. Anytime the acid does eat through the mucus and begins to destroy the epithelial cells, then we have something called an ulcer. And the stomach can become ulcerous if the acids are beginning to eat through it. Anything that would cause a decrease in the mucus production could lead to ulcers. And the first thing that comes to mind to myself and most people is stress. People that are under a lot of stress, that stress affects the body by slowing down the digestive process, slowing down all the activities of digestion. And that becomes a big problem. That becomes a problem because that decreases the mucus production and leaves the stomach vulnerable to the acids that are produced there. Now, the food, after it's been thoroughly liquefied and after it is squirted through that pyloric sphincter valve, now enters the small intestine. And we call this liquefied food chyme. And it squirts into the small intestine. And hopefully you'll remember these terms here. The duodenum is that first part of the small intestine. That leads to the jejunum. The jejunum then leads to the ileum. Those are the three parts of the small intestine. You can even see in the picture here, though, the cecum, maybe you remember that, the pouch-like beginning of the large intestine. In a human being, the little vermiform appendix. We didn't see it in the cat because the cats don't have those. And of course here the ascending colon. Now we'll leave the large intestine for later, but let's begin to talk about the small intestine, and let's talk about the duodenum here. The duodenum is described as the first 12 inches of the small intestine. There are two major purposes for this beginning of the small intestine, and the first is to neutralize all those acids from the stomach. And so a lot of different fluids are added to the chyme at this point, which do neutralize those acids. Brings the pH up closer to a pH 7. Also here, very large quantities of enzymes and bile from the liver are going to be added to this chyme. If we focus more closely then just on the duodenum here, of course, the stomach leads in, and the next section, the jejunum, is what comes out of here. If you look closely, you can see the entrance of both the tube from the liver, the bile duct, and the tube that comes through the pancreas. And we want to first here talk about neutralizing those acids. And one of the biggest contributor is the pancreas. The yellow gland-like structure that you see here is the pancreas. It does have a body, which is that thick part right in the curve of the duodenum with its tail running out across. And much of the fluid, you can see the little tube in the pancreas, that pancreatic duct is collecting fluid, and much of this fluid contains buffers. And perhaps from chemistry, you remember that buffers are chemicals that neutralize pH, either by neutralizing acids or neutralizing bases, either one. So, the walls of the duodenum itself also produce buffers. So this acidic chyme from the stomach gets hit with a double whammy. The duodenum also produces quite a bit of mucus. And like that mucus is protecting the stomach, there's quite a bit of mucus here protecting this first part of the small intestine from that acid. As we get further and further along the small intestine, there's less and less mucus. Okay, so we've got the food into the small intestine. We've got it thoroughly liquefied. We've got it neutralized now. And there's one last thing that needs to happen physically to the food before it can really be acted on chemically. And that is going to be something that will help us to digest fats. And that is the chemical that is produced and supplied by the liver. So here is sort of a diagram of the duodenum, the pancreas, and the liver. And you can see that green tube coming from the liver. The liver, we know, produces a fluid, which is actually the waste product of the liver, but that fluid is called bile. And bile is going to accomplish one other means of physical digestion. We haven't even begun to dissolve the food molecules much yet. There was some protein digestion in the stomach, but not much. As the food enters the duodenum, though, the bile is going to cause fats to mix with the water. Now, you probably know that oil and water do not mix. That if you put a watery substance and an oily or fatty substance together, they don't mix. If you go to the supermarket, you can find some salad dressings that you physically have to shake before you pour them because they've got an oil and a water in there and they separate. You can put some oil and water in a jar and shake it rapidly and it'll look mixed for a split second, but very, very rapidly they will divide. And this is, again, chemistry. This is because some molecules are hydrophilic, that's water loving, and some are hydrophobic, that's water fearing. And fats and oils are hydrophobic, so they have no affinity for water. Now that's a problem because when you eat fats and they're in this digestive process, the stomach can churn them around like you would shaking a jar with oil and water in it. But the moment there's a pause, the oil or fats totally separate from the watery material and will form into large clumps. So bile is going to cause those small droplets or those large amounts of fat to break down into small droplets of fat. And that is the process that we call emulsification. And you would recognize this in when you go to the supermarket. There are some salad dressings there that stay mixed. And they stay mixed because the company that produced them added an emulsifier to them, which caused the water molecules and the oil molecules to cling to one another and stay in a mixed suspension. So that does happen. Or like a very common one in your house, if you have grease or something oily on your hands, maybe you were cooking or handling some greasy meat or something, you can put your hands under the water and rub them all you want, but it's not going to go down the drain. Soap is an emulsifier, and by rubbing your hands in the water with soap on them, the oils or greases will be mixed with the water, and the water can then wash them down the drain. So this is a physical process of reducing the oils to small droplets so they can be attacked by the enzymes that are going to cause the chemical digestion. Now, so we know what bile does now. Let's see where it comes from. Here is a description of bile production in the liver. Now let me focus your attention on a couple of things. The first thing I'd like you to see is all of these separate hexagonal structures that we see within the liver. If you take some tissue from the liver and put it under a microscope, you're going to see this hexagonal arrangement of cells. The cells are those lighter yellowish colored structures, and you can see that they're formed into columns that radiate out from what is known as a central vein. At each point of the hexagon, at each angle of the hexagon, you see three tubes, which are collectively known as a portal triad. The one that we want to look at first is the blue one, which is blood that's coming from your digestive tract. And that tube is known as a portal vein. It's carrying nutrient-rich blood, but obviously, because it's blue, oxygen-poor blood. The oxygen is not the important part, it's the nutrients and all. And you can see that that blood coming up through that tube then moves through the columns of hepatocytes, or liver cells. And as it does, the cells there, the vein that's running through there, really more like a capillary, is very porous and allows chemicals from that to enter the liver cells. The liver cells then make the chemical changes that are necessary to any of the molecules. That's put back into those portal veins, and that fluid then moves through there and into the central vein, which is collecting all of this processed blood. So it's the blood moving up the portal vein through the columns of hepatocytes, the blood being processed and then being collected by the central vein. Now that central vein then will unite with all the other central veins to form what are called hepatic veins, and those ultimately lead to the inferior vena cava, which I've abbreviated IVC there near the top of the picture. The other two tubes that you see in that portal triad are the hepatic artery that you see. And that hepatic artery is red. It's carrying oxygenated blood. Obviously, the hepatocytes here in the columns could not survive without oxygen. So there is an artery, and you can see it joins the hepatic vein. There is an artery adding oxygen to the blood here, and that supplies the needs of these cells. So the liver has these separate arteries bringing it oxygen. The third tube that you see there is a hepatic duct, and you can see parts of it lead up through the columns of cells, and these little hepatic ducts are collecting the waste products of the chemical actions of these hepatocytes. And those waste products then collected into these hepatic ducts are where the production of the bile occurs. The bile is the waste product of these actions. So this picture visualizes all of that structure. And if we take it one more step further, here is at a larger level, here are those blood vessels and the part that they do. The portal veins there in sort of a chartreuse, sort of a pinkish purple color. Blood vessels coming from the digestive system, bringing the blood to be processed into the liver. The hepatic veins in blue, which are then collecting that processed blood and getting it into general circulation. The hepatic arteries that are coming ultimately from the aorta that are feeding blood into the liver, feeding oxygenated blood into the liver. And then the green, the bile ducts then collecting the waste product and leading it out to where it can be stored. And of course that is this right here. And let's just describe the last thing we want to do here in this first digestive lecture is describe that bile storage and release. There are two hepatic ducts that are bringing that bile from the liver. But let me put all of the tubes in first, and then we'll describe them one by one. Of course, we know the pancreatic duct from the pancreas. The common bile duct is the one that's leading actually to the duodenum. There are the left and right hepatic ducts, and you see that little fork of two green tubes coming out of the liver. And then there is the cystic duct. And bile that is produced by the liver, if there's very little digestion going on, is saved. The bile just doesn't run down automatically to the duodenum. From the hepatic ducts, it flows down to the juncture there and up through the tube that leads to the gallbladder. And you see that big green pouch on the inferior side of the liver is the gallbladder. And by the way, the liver is turned up so that you can see underneath it, because the gallbladder is underneath the liver. But the hepatic ducts and then the cystic duct lead the bile up into the gallbladder where it is stored. And it's basically being stored for the next major meal that comes down the tube. So when you're not digesting, this bile is being stored. When you are digesting, then this bile will go through this pathway back down the cystic duct and then down the common bile duct and then enter into the small intestine. And it then, as we said before, performs that physical breakdown of the food, not all foods, but specifically the fatty foods. And we should probably mention here too that a person that has had their gallbladder removed then does not store any bile. The bile is produced 24 hours a day and just drips its way out of the liver and into the small intestine. That bile is not necessarily good for the small intestine unless there's a lot of food to absorb it. Because it breaks down fats and the membranes of cells are made out of fats, it's just not good to be hanging around. So people that have had their gallbladder removed typically eat many small meals a day rather than big meals. They might have 6 small meals every day rather than 3 large meals, so that there is so there's always some food there in the digestive tract to absorb and utilize that bile, and you don't get it hanging around. So people that have had their gallbladders removed also have to be very careful about the amount of fat that's in any one meal they eat, because that fatty material isn't going to get broken down, is going to go through the system and not be well digested, and that's going to be a problem. So this is the end of our first digestive lecture, and we'll pick it up from here in the next one.